All right. Is it recording? Yes, it is. Um, so this weekend I was thinking about the deterministic belief and the free will belief. And Rob, last time we talked, you brought up the question is, do we believe both are possible? And right away I said yes. And so I thought more about that, why and what that looks like. Um, and a lot of it comes down to yes, there is a very deterministic way of things like physics and chemistry and things work that way. But even between them, there's a lot of non-determinacy. Like everyone tried to say that, oh, at some point, everything's going to be explained by physics, right? Atoms colliding and combining and so on. But we have no idea how it goes from physics, and atoms colliding to biology, to cells, to things that do that kind of stuff. Even like water molecules. Like, why does H2O, why does two hydrogen and one oxygen equal water? We have no idea. And the properties of water, we have none of that idea. So there is actually determinacy and indeterminacy in different levels of both living and non-living things. So, for example, like I just said, oxygen, why does two hydrogen and one oxygen equal the properties of water? We have no clue. There's nothing in hydrogen that says and oxygen that says it equals these properties. It's just some other thing that's but we know that it does. So it's very deterministic in that way. But there's also an area of non-determinism or free will. I wouldn't call that free will, but there's just non-determinism. So once you get to more complex things like humans, that gives us the ability to take the things of the world that automatically happen and us impact those. If we're actually impacting how the deterministic things work and function and move and stuff with our ability to choose decisions, to morally reason, to analyze situations and go from there. And so I think that's probably the easiest way of looking at it is assuming that we can't actually impact anything outside of us, which is I think is a very weird way of looking at the world because everyone naturally believes they have an impact on the world, and to have that impact to change how things go and having that choice to choose, meaning like, oh, I could choose whether this is moral or not. That is actually the free will, not the impact that it has after that, right? And a lot of people say, oh, it goes to the whole God thing. If he knows everything, how does then we have free will? It's actually easy. It's like someone who's watches a situation and knows, oh, this person's going to make a really bad choice because they've done that for a while and whatever. I'm not influencing their choice. I just understand the parameters around all the choices of beings and saying they're probably going to make a bad choice. And you'll be right 99% of the time. It's just someone who has a bigger picture that allows us to see, but it doesn't actually impact their free will by actually me knowing them being able to make the decision they're going to make. I just know better of how their life is, their free will, right? If they have free will or not free will, if they're addicted to something, you basically can predict exactly what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And that's more of the um, deterministic approach is when you have no free will. You're literally just doing exactly what you're programmed to do, what your body tells you to do, how it tells you to do because you're addicted to it. When you to the other end of free will, it's it's harder to pinpoint that, but it still brings back a difference between deterministic and being able to choose and make your own stuff. So I think they actually go really well together, and it's not binary as Brian said last time. It's there is a spectrum that impacts all of that, and with AI, it can show um, it's very deterministic in the fact that it took everything that we do and basically it's pattern recognition, right? Saying, oh, if we do this, do this. If you do this, do this. If you do this, do this. And that doesn't that's a very interesting thing that most people confuse with free will as well. Um, so that was just kind of the thought that I had over the weekend of how those two work together.
Greg, I've just got one question on that
Yeah.
before Brian jumps in. Who should care about that and why?
Well, it's it all comes down to the people who are pushing determinism and non-determinism, and then their worldview of what things look like. So if you believe in determinism, which means you're just a product of your upbringing, you really have no choice, you have no free will, you can't, whatever. Basically, there is no right and there is no wrong with determinism. It's kind of just, it is what it is, it's function how you function. And if you believe in that, then your world is much different than someone who believes they have a choice, they have a impact on the world around them, they have stuff. So that's where that makes the biggest difference in my mind, is that if you're deterministic, then it's like it doesn't matter what I do, I'm supposed to do it. So I can go
I'll
murder
give you
someone,
an
or I can go
I'll give you an
not.
example, then I'll switch to mine. I think that makes Greg's point on the determinism thing. If I'm a materialist and everything is determined by neurons firing, your upbringing, and 100% it's determined that you cannot respond to it, there is no free will. There is no rational argument to say, okay, we should protect human life, right? We should rehabilitate people. We should improve lives of um, convicts or of children that are, abused in youth or whatever. Like you can predict, I believe, by age 4 or 5, depending on how socialized the young boys are, what their criminal activity is going to be later in life. Like the rational thing to do with that, if they are not individually unique and have dignity because of their soul, is to eliminate them. Like, why would you invest society's money and efforts to rehabilitate this person? We have plenty of other people out there, right? They're no different than, is it wrong to put down your dog that has, a disease and is in a ton of pain? That's pretty morally acceptable across the planet. Um, why is it wrong to put down your auntie when she's sick or whatever? Like, there is no difference. And this is the thing that I find to be so ironic is you have the arguments for like, hey, if like Peter Singer is a famous ethicist that claims that all animals have rights because they're sentient. And the irony of his statement is he implies that humans have rights with no reason behind that, and therefore imparts that on animals. But the opposite is actually true. If animals and humans are no different, they're both sentient beings, then neither one really has any rights. Because why would they? Why are we better than an ant or a termite? And they'll use some squishy thing like, well, one's more sentient or one's more intelligent or whatever else. But AI has proven intelligence and sentience can be thrown out the window, and then we are lesser than these artificial beings. And so the conclusion that, hey, we should be treating animals better because they're similar to humans, where they're the same as humans, because we're both going to die, we're just a bunch of atoms, we're just material, um, is based on a really basic assumption that for some reason we have value as living beings. And where did that value come from? You can't just assume that and then take everything from it. That has to come from somewhere. And so if you're deterministic and there's no free will and everything is just material, the basis for any sort of human rights and morality doesn't exist. The best they could come up with is, well, if you treat people better, then they're less likely to kill other people, and that overall is better. But even that in itself isn't an obvious argument, meaning, so what? So, so one person is bad and they hurt other people, but like, it's just, I exterminated some ants and crawling into my house. What's the difference? There isn't one unless there's some underpinning reason for that. Which I don't know, you guys can clarify if you have any questions on that, but that does tie into some of the points that I was going to come to, which is all of these systems are based on faith. They have core underlying axioms. So the deterministic free will doesn't exist axiom is, the basis of it is, there is nothing immaterial in existence. This is obviously completely false and easily demonstrably false, which is mathematics has no material basis and it clearly exists. Information has no material basis and it clearly exists. Other things such as love, and you can say, wait a sec, what about chemicals in the brain? And this is all, love begins when the like stops, is the phrase I like to use in relationships. When you stop liking someone, when you're angry at your child, when you're not happy with your spouse, that's when love begins. Prior to that, maybe there's some chemicals that are keeping you, attracted to or connected to them. But that's not love. Love is the commitment beyond when those things go away. And so how do we know that? Well, we can observe it. And can you quantify it? No, not scientifically. There's no way to absolutely quantify it as does, Chuck love his daughter more than his wife. Like, first of all, why would you ever want to? That's a horrible thing to even try to quantify. But secondly, you can't. Like, that's just a ridiculous thing, yet we know it exists. And so materialism is false in so many basic ways. So the fact that your whole belief system is based on that axiom that determinism, that free will don't exist because there's nothing immaterial in the mix. And all we can look at is what's material, neurons firing and upbringing and brain functions and so on, is easily false. Now, I guess interrupt there before I do my sort of shift. Do you have any questions or feedback on that?
Now I'm curious how you're going to shift now.
Chuck, I thought you were going to jump in with something. I'm disappointed.
No, no, let him keep going. Let him keep going, because if I jump in on something, we'll go way off on another tangent. And I want to see what tangent Brian's going to.
So the book that I'm basing most of my feedback on is the most thorough that I've come across arguing the free will doesn't exist. It's Robert Sapolsky. It's a book called Determined. And I actually think his book proves the Catholic worldview on free will. Like, it is the best evidence that I have seen for the Catholic understanding of free will for at least 2,000 years. And I actually think the vast majority of it was developed before that in Judaism, going back 4,000 years.
Before we go any further, then is he Catholic? And
He
the
is
next
a
question
materialist atheist.
How is he raised?
okay,
I would say he's, based on his writings, I would put him into anti-Catholic and probably anti-religion.
Wow.
and
But he doesn't know what he's like. He is ignorant of the Catholic position. He just has sort of these sound bites of like,
Oh,
you know,
no.
oh, Galileo, bad Catholic. Like, it's not really a thought process. It's just I have these memes in my head of what religion and Catholicism is, and therefore I'm just gonna whack them with a mole stick and or whatever that whack-a-mole game is and act like I'm intelligent. But no, I'll lay out exactly how I think he has proven the Catholic worldview of what free will looks like.
Right.
So his primary arguments are ones that are totally based on material, like how does the brain react? And so they come down to essentially, I would say, two big arguments. One, the way you were raised impacts entirely how you're going to end up as an adult, right? So if you're abused as a child, if you were mistreated as a child, and so on. And we talked about this previously, which was in that list of psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and so on. One of the main criteria is divorce. So there's one right there that I find very interesting because Catholics don't believe in divorce. There's no such thing in Catholicism. They have what's called an annulment, but annulment states that a legal binding marriage never existed, and that gets complicated. We don't have to get into that. But they, agree with Jesus that what's been bound by God cannot be put asunder, I think is the actual term. So there's one point. In the Bible, it says this is the Old Testament. So this is why I think this is actually Hebrew, back to Hebrew and Judaism, that the sins of the father extend to the child down to the fourth generation. And I think that's really interesting because that's essentially what he's saying, which is like, I don't affect my upbringing. My upbringing is largely based on what my parents have done, and what their upbringing is largely done what their parents have done. Yet we do have multiple people, multiple parents coming together, right? Because my mom would have been raised differently than my father and so on. Okay, so the biblical teaching on that I think is very interesting from a psychological and a even physical genetic point of view. So epigenetics teaches us that if my grandmother smokes, even if she never met my children, not my grandmother, if my mother smoked, even if she never met my children, epigenetic expression in the genes for my children, her grandchildren, would be affected. So that's two generations there, right? But we also see things like people who are raised by alcoholics are more likely to become alcoholic. People who are raised by abusive parents are more likely to be abusive themselves. There is something that happens in that upbringing that extends on for multiple generations. And I've talked about this in regard specifically to divorce, that those children, their entire lives are affected, their relationships, how they interact with the world, their trust for people, and so on, which they then impart on their children and so on. So we've seen this. I mean, this, again, 4,000-year-old Bible teaching about the sins of the father are passed down to the fourth generation. I don't believe that's purely a spiritual statement. I think that is a psychological statement and also understanding the upbringing. So we've known for thousands of years that it's crucially important to raise children properly, or else there is going to be this long-term detrimental effect to them, right? So his suggestion that, hey, this is true and therefore we're predetermined, I guess predetermined is the wrong word, but we're determined as a reaction to that is only part of the story. The rest of the story is, yet not 100% of people that were raised by alcoholics become alcoholics. Not 100% of people who were raised in abusive families become abusive. Not 100% of people who are raised in poverty remain in poverty, and on and on and on. There is an option, there is opportunity to change those things. That doesn't mean they don't matter. That doesn't mean they aren't impactful. It doesn't mean that you're not at a huge disadvantage in all these types of things. I think you can take it even a step further. So the Catholic tradition and a lot of faith traditions in Christianity, though not all of them, do what's called infant baptisms. So the theological understanding of that is from the fall of Adam and Eve, you have original sin that entered the world, and therefore the gift of being in perfect union with God was given away. So they lost that gift. So that inheritance they could no longer pass along to the next generations. So it wasn't that God like punished them, so to speak. They just gave it up. They chose that not to imagine if they had $1 million, they just wasted the $1 million, and now they couldn't pass that inheritance down to their children. So that inheritance is gone. Everyone born has the original sin. Well, the Bible in Romans says the wages of sin are death. So there is punishment for that sin. Now, as parents, you have an authority over your children. Now, that's just simply biological, if nothing else, right? Without the parents taking care of the kids die. Like if you just left your kid there, they can't survive. So there is an authority there that's just part of survival. Well, spiritually, there's also an authority there that a parent has the right and the ability to baptize their child, which brings them into the Christian church. It also gets rid of that original sin. So that if they die, they're going straight to heaven. So if I didn't want to baptize my children, but my brother decided he wants to, and he secretly went and tried to get him baptized, he could, possibly get him baptized, but it's invalid because he doesn't have the authority to do that. And I think this is a recognition of the things that Sapolsky's talking about, which is the parenting and the upbringing and who's in charge has a serious impact on the physical being of that child. And the spiritual parallel to that, as I'm saying, is infant baptism and the authority that comes from that, which again goes all the way back to the beginning of Christianity, 33 AD, in that understanding. So sins passed down to multiple generations. They're all based on axiom and faith. I think another one is, this is where Greg was kind of going, the interconnectedness of each other, right? Chuck's life, even though I only see him a few times a year, we interact online a lot, impacts my life, positively or negatively. And everybody part of your family, the closer the relationships, the bigger the impact, right? Like I guarantee you, if we have team members who have good supportive spouses, they will be much better than team members who don't. That's absolutely true. You cannot separate your entire world and just compartmentalize it into work. If you have somebody that supports you and you can talk about work and they're proud of you and all of these types of things, and you can do the same for them, your quality of work and effort is going to be better. I tell my kids all the time, I mean, they're young, so they're emotional, they get upset. Hey, you can't learn things when you're emotional upset. If you want to get better at, we're mini golfing this weekend, golf, you can't be throwing the putter and yelling and getting all mad. And this isn't Happy Gilmore. Like to learn, you have to be in a certain mindset. And so these are things that the people around you have a major impact on. Like anybody that has kids knows the peer lessons that they learn can be very good or they can be very poor. Well, the biblical precedence for this is there's a paralytic who can't walk, obviously. Jesus is in a crowd, he's in a home, he's teaching, and they can't get to him. And so the friends of the paralytic put a hole in the roof and drop the paralytic down. And when Jesus heals the paralytic and helps him walk, he then says, your faith has saved you. But he's saying you're to the friends. The faith of the friends is what saved the person. The person himself couldn't have done anything. They couldn't walk, they couldn't move, they couldn't get through the crowd. But it was the faith of the friends. And so, again, I think Sapolsky's point about the importance of the community and the education and the upbringing and what schools you go to, like, yeah, all of this is absolutely true. But none of that says, okay, all of everything that you do then is completely determined and can't be adjusted for, unless you start with an axiomatic faith that the only things in the world are immaterial, which we already disproved because mathematics and information both exist and they're immaterial. So if we accept that truth, now it sounds like he's really just described the Catholic understanding of free will and what that looks like. And the final point here I would say on this is, well, I actually have two, sorry. One, the more you live in virtue, so that would be joy and love and kindness, compassion, giving, and so on, the more you improve in so many different ways. We can look at the psychological factors and so on. You are more joyful as a person. You want to give more. You guys know anybody that's generous, you see this in their life. But the opposite is true also. As you habitually sin, you become more closed off to those other virtues. It becomes easier to sin. You justify it. The sin now becomes something that's just natural to you to the point where you don't even think it's wrong anymore. Right? And so again, the neuroscience is backing this up and saying, okay, well, these people don't believe in wrong. Whatever you say is wrong or is immoral. It's like, yeah, because you've habitually trained yourself to ignore that part of your conscience. And the final point would be the understanding of what is sin. And I mentioned this last time. A mortal sin requires full knowledge and full freedom. Right? So my child, if my 6-year-old hits my 4-year-old, there isn't a mortal sin there because they don't have full knowledge of like the pain and so on to that. Does that mean you don't correct them? Well, no. Again, your community, your parents, all this huge impact, and it's your responsibility to train on what's right and wrong. But to say, okay, you've forfeited your salvation because you did something as a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old is totally not accurate. Well, there's people whose minds have been harmed by their surroundings, by their family, by whatever, that when they're 28 years old, they don't have the mental capability or the emotional capability to make good decisions. Right? All these things that we just talked about. And so their responsibility for that sin, for that evil, for whatever they've done is greatly diminished. And we don't know that. Only God knows how much it is and what the culpability is, but it could be the fact that that's not even a valid sin. You can think of somebody that's has a mental handicap or something like that, for instance, but those handicaps could be introduced simply because of abuse and things that happened in their childhood. So if you wrap all of that stuff together, I think he has proven what we've talked about for at least 2,000, maybe 4,000 years, is the way that free will actually works, which is these core systems affecting the individual. And if you look at it from that perspective, now all of a sudden it's like, okay, what can we do to support the family? What can we do to teach people to be better parents? What can we do to help relationships survive and stay together for the betterment of the children? What can we do in education? What can we do in teaching kids to love and be kind and have compassion and generosity and all these things? Because you know what? It's not determined. These are things that now give them the ability to have the free will to choose right and wrong without, I would say, the scar tissue of the bad things that limit their ability to choose good and choose the free will. Freely choose the good. Sorry, I said that kind of poorly. So
Right.
that's how I think Sapolsky has proven the Catholic position on free will.
Right, I want to go back to sin, like original sin that you mentioned, and try and shift it a little bit more towards the AI conversation. So clearly, from your understanding, and you've just educated me on, I guess, the Catholic belief system, that original sin came from Adam and Eve, and then it's just been passed down, right? Everyone has that within them. So AI, as it stands right now, then, is also has inherited that, right? And it's trained on information from the internet, which is, let's be honest, full of sin. So how do we get away from that? Or how do we try to, I'm going to use the word again, regulate that, like the church has done with the Bible, which is not necessarily a set of rules, I don't believe, but it's more of a way to educate yourself or to live better, I guess, live with more virtue. And do you think it's possible that a pure AI could be created without sin?
Yeah, so I think Chuck has some thoughts on this as well because he was talking about this weekend with us. So I want to be really clear: AI can't sin. Your dog can't sin. It's only something that a rational being with free will can have. So, yeah, another argument that I would say is from Sapolsky to us is what's the difference between This is where we start our conversation between a dog and a human. Well, if you believe everything's determined, there is no difference. It's the will, it's the rational nature of our souls that makes us different from any other living being. So AI can't sin because it doesn't have a soul. So we'll be clear there, but it's trained on things that maybe are, or I would say definitely are imperfect. And that's the whole point of this question, right? So if there's nothing that makes humans unique, there's no such thing as a human right. Why would there be a human right if the human's just another animal? Any more than there's, the Bill of Ant Rights or the Bill of Termite Rights or the Bill of Dog Rights or whatever else you want to make it. The Bill of Bacteria Rights. Like, there's no difference if we're all just things without souls. And so when you look at it from that perspective,
is there no difference because of religion, or is there no difference because they don't have those rights? Because this particular religion focuses on one God and everything that comes below it. But I think I'm right in saying that the Romans worship elements and certain different things. So if that had been allowed to continue and flourish in a different way, the world would have gone a different path, and maybe some of those things would have happened. So I guess the question I'm asking is it because they don't have rights and that's absolutely set in stone and there's no way that would be possible? Or is it if we just taken a different path that those things might exist? They might be codified.
So I love the question because this gives me a whole other topic I would love to dig into. I believe that without Christianity, the Roman society is what we'd still have today. A version of it. Maybe it's not the Romans particularly, which is not a good thing, right? Depending on whose history you read, 60-ish% of Romans were slaves and all kinds of slaves. And this wasn't, even race or whatever based, like they were, it was just not a good system. I mean, look at the gladiators and so on. There was no such thing as really human rights. There were definitely class systems. The only people that had any sort of rights were the people that were fully Roman citizens. And I mean, just bad stuff came from that. What changed? What was the recognition that every human being, right? There is no free, there is no slave, there is no woman, there is no man. This is, what it says in the Bible in 1 Corinthians. I think it's 1 Corinthians. That we are all unique because you're made in the image and likeness of God. What does that mean? That you have an immortal soul. That's it. That's how we're made in his image, that we have something that lets us live on forever. And if you don't recognize that, then Roman society is fine. What's the difference if I own 30 slaves and I use them for whatever I want? But what would be the argument against that? There is no rational reason to say there's a difference there. Or why can't women be property? They're obviously come up with some other list. They're weaker or they're less intelligent, or we'll go whole Borat on people. Like
these are good points. But I think it is important to recognize that that our Western society, which has been built on Christianity or Catholicism, also had slaves. Like it's not binary. It's not black and white. So there's two societies.
Well, it's also the first society they got rid of them.
Yeah, but again, if the Romans have been allowed to continue, and I'm using Romans as one example, I guess you could use pagans or whatever else that worshipped Greeks. I mean, Romans got compared to that, but Phoenicians or whatever it was, I think potentially they would have become more enlightened, which is what we were allowed to do, as a race, I guess you would call it. So potentially that could have happened. So I think it's important to mention that.
Well, okay, so here's the interesting thing. If we actually can do that thought experiment by looking at history, and here's how you do it. Let's look at what happened in the Christian world, so that the European world, essentially, from Jesus's time till 1500 years later, when they're starting to eliminate slavery and starting to talk about these things. None of this happened overnight. Let's be clear, you're not going to change an entire society, especially when information moves slowly in a short amount of time. It takes time. And the development of human rights is starting to come into play. Science is starting to come into play. How do these things, scientific method and so on. Okay, well, let's look at the rest of the world. What happened in Africa? What happened in the Central Australia with the tribes that are there? What happened in South America? What happened in North America? There is no science, effectively. There is no understanding of human rights, effectively. All of them still have, I wouldn't say all of them, there actually were individual tribes that you can look at that didn't have slaves. But might have a chief that buried his favorite wife with him alive,
Yeah.
right? So everybody else was cool as long as you weren't the chief's favorite wife. And then she would, so they still did things that were like, okay, that's not really good. Depending on whose research you read, again, history and Maya, and some people say they sacrificed 85,000 people a year. Others say that's not physically possible. That's too many people for them to even physically walk up there. Whatever the number is, they killed a lot of people for their gods, right? So the fact that it took a century and a half to start seeing the scientific progress and so on, but that almost only existed. You have some flashes of this in China. You have some flashes of, scientific method in the Middle East and so on. But almost entirely, it's European and Christian in origin. Let's say it's at least 80-20, right? And so I think you have a very good case there to then say, okay, this wasn't going to just develop without Christian understanding and morals, because it didn't develop. When we just look at history, you can still do that. You can find hunter-gatherer tribes that still exist today in various parts of the world. I remember reading about one in the Indian Ocean and island that some person tried to visit that was obviously, not part of their tribe, and went to the island, and there was some sort of internet discussion, maybe it was a video of then the guy just getting speared, right? And then like the whole internet was like, well, he deserved it. And it's like, I mean, he didn't really deserve to get murdered. I was just walking on a beach. It's a little bit harsh, but so we still see that outside of Christianity. I'd put it in a very specific way. The more exposure you have to Christianity, the more scientific you are, because you understand there's an ordered universe. No other belief system had that understanding. An ordered universe comes from an ordered God, right? The Muslim understanding was not that. So there were a few people outside of the system that basically were like, well, I'm going to do my own scientific stuff. But by and large, the Muslim understanding of God is that God could do anything, and there's no point in understanding the world because he could just change it, right? And so the scientific method couldn't evolve there. And we see that across all tribal nations with spirits and these belief systems and so on. So the idea that, hey, this would just happen on its own, it didn't. There's no evidence of that. When we look at anyone that wasn't exposed to Christianity, there is no development of the scientific method.
Well, I can have more questions, but not because I'm trying to challenge anything, just because I don't know enough. But I feel like living in Europe, I feel like the church didn't always support scientific development. So is that true?
Well, it depends on how you define church, and it depends on, meaning you have an organization right now with 1.2 billion people in the Catholic Church today. At any given time, I don't know, tens of millions of people are currently sinning and doing bad things that are church members, right? And so I would just say, if your definition of a true church is the one that has no sin and no evil, then there's no such thing as church. Like, then that's just not the case. So
No, that's definitely not the definition. That the whole no sin conversation started because I asked if it's possible to build a model, an AI model that is pure and without the sins of its fathers, right? The people that are building it.
all right, so I think you're actually asking the same question now. All right, so what I mean by that is, okay, so you can't look at the people that say I'm a thing, but don't really believe it and don't really follow it, right? I can claim, Chuck was mentioned this last time, well, I went to church. Okay, that doesn't mean anything. Like, that doesn't mean you're adherent, you're a follower. So if we look at 1.2 billion Catholics, or like in the US, like 60% of them don't even go to church. Okay, so now we're getting down to a smaller percentage. And then you say, okay, what are those 60%? How many actually adhere to the belief system? Now it's like 10%. And so you keep whittling down to say, okay, well, what's the beliefs and who follows it? And we go through this in our book, Soulless Intelligence. We say, okay, so if you did that and you looked at all of the belief systems and took the purest believers, not the ones that claim it, but the ones that follow it. And I think in the Catholic Church, you end up with a really interesting result, because I would suggest that the greatest that humanity has ever produced are the Catholic saints. Meaning these are people who were selfless. They live for sometimes their children, they were married couples that have become saints. Sometimes they're, clergy, but a lot of times they're not. They're individuals that have, they work and have businesses, or whatever the case may be. Sometimes they're kings or queens or princes or princesses and so on at different levels. But all of them give selflessly of themselves to support other people. And I would say if you could train AI to say what's the best of humanity and that's how you as AI should act, what would that look like? And I would challenge that it would be hard to find a group of people that's been across every culture, every ethnicity, 2,000 plus years of history, tens of thousands of them. So we have not just one or two or Dalai Lamas or Buddhas or 7 of them or whatever, like tens of thousands of these people that meet this criteria. And again, diverse cultures, they've been all parts of the world, all continents, and so on. I don't know that you could find a better example of what I would want AI to act like than to say the Catholic saints, the best of that faith. Now that's a small percentage, right? If I'm saying it's 10,000, let's say, out of probably 2 billion plus in the history of the church, that leaves a lot of room for some bad actors, and there's plenty of those. But how else would you look at it? You can't look at the people that claim, like, hey, I'm a mathematician, I just don't believe in addition. Well, okay, is that the mathematician I really want to use as my example? Probably not.
Right, go Chuck, you got anything to
And
add
to
to
counter
this?
your point about the science thing, for 600 years, the number one funder of astronomy in the entire world has been the Catholic Church. For 600 years, straight through Galileo, which they offered to fund his research. That's a whole different story. If you think Galileo was persecuted, I would just say, if your parent was persecuted by an evil organization, would you follow that organization? He died with last rites of the church, and his daughter was a nun. So it's really hard to imagine, okay, I'm going to be a Catholic nun after they just, tortured or hurt or, did all these horrible things to my dad, but I'm going to be a nun. Like the story that you have, and I don't think we have time to get into it today, but the sort of meme of, church bad, Galileo good is not at all the reality there.
I get that, I haven't raised that meme, but I would need to do more reading on it. But from my understanding, it's not always been a black and white, here's some money, go and do great
that's
things.
like the
But
only meme.
relationship.
But what's I don't think I've ever
I
heard
don't know.
anybody
I can't answer the question. I'd
by
have to look
church,
up. I'm sure on the I could do a quick Google search and come up with 5 different things. Probably 4 of them are not
probably
true.
can't.
So to
You'd be
be clear,
surprised.
Rob, there are Christians who do play down science. They just literally say it's faith only. Like that's all.
Oh yeah, well that's ridiculous.
And yeah, and so I don't know if that's what you're referring to as the
No.
church, because
No,
that's not
definitely
the Catholic Church. Okay.
No, I'm not trying to make that argument, or I'm not trying to bring that into the
No,
conversation.
I'm just
It's not
I'm
relevant.
just saying that that is out there. There are, there are extremes on, who only science, only faith, but the Catholic teaching from the very beginning is faith and science play together harmoniously. Why? Because God created both. God is both. There's no way they can contradict each other or be against each other, right? So it's either our interpretation or understanding is off, or our knowledge of science is off, or whatever. But they have to both be basically work together to tell the true God, because God doesn't contradict.
I read a book recently that gave credit, Greg, to the book of nature, like the book of science and the book of God, to Francis Bacon. I think it's who he gave it credit to. I was an atheist that wrote the book, and I'm like, wait a sec. A few hundred years before that, Aquinas was talking about that, and it possibly even was Augustine, 100 years before that. But the atheist didn't like those guys, so he gave the credit to an Enlightenment thinker instead of to the original source, which I found to be quite interesting. But that kind of stuff you'll see, because nobody's going to fact check him, because it's only a bunch of atheists reading it, and they're going to be like, oh yeah, see, it was somebody from the Enlightenment that came up with this concept of the book of nature. It's like, nope.
And so what Brian's saying is, like, everyone's searching for truth, right? So the atheists are seeing their truths, the Muslims, the Buddhists, the Christians, the Catholics, the whatever. Everyone's searching for truth, and that's kind of where everyone has some portion of the truth, right? You see things, you realize stuff, things growing, things not, and so it's like, okay, what is the most accurate? Who predicted the most accurate truth? Who understands it the best? And it's a tough thing to decipher and to figure out, because a lot of things sound really good, They're really accurate. You're like, oh yeah, that's totally it. Like that's 100%. It takes a lot of research and time and effort to actually pinpoint what that looks like. Like for example, Brian mentioned the virtues and vices. Like Christianity and a lot of belief systems have been pointing out the value of these virtues for society forever. It's taken 2,000 years for science and psychology to catch up to the value of these things and say, oh, look, there's this test that proved that, yes, it's good to have this virtue, to love, to have temperance, all these things. It's like, yeah, we've known about this stuff for thousands of years. Like same thing with philosophy. Like philosophy predicted things that we're just now starting to realize with science and understand as a society. And so it's actually quite funny how people just ignored all of that until science said it was right, and then they're trying to put something in place and say, oh look, science says it's right, so there's only science, there's only this, there's only that. So
I am listening, but I was also dropped a link there because I said I could do it in 5 seconds, and that was my 5-second search. I've not even read the article, but there's content there to say that the church and science weren't always best friends, right? And it wasn't necessarily the church's interest for
I
science
can
to
look through these and
disprove
see,
some of the
but
things.
these weren't all the same church.
Yeah, our first one's Muslim church, right? But then it does go down to Catholicism. I'm on very shaky ground here because I don't know enough about it. And I'm
Well, this
talking to
article
three
is
people who
completely
do.
wrong. I read one sentence about Galileo. His research was instantly criticized by the Catholic Church for going against the established scripture that places Earth and not the sun at the center of the universe. That's not true. Like that's just a completely false statement. So Cardinal Bellarmine is how you say his name, I'm pretty sure. He offered to fund Galileo's research. The issue that the Catholic Church had was he was claiming that it was true and he couldn't scientifically prove it yet. It wasn't until was it Brahe who came after Galileo? I can't remember off the top of my head. No, it wasn't
No, it wasn't him.
Copernicus. I'll have to think about it in a second. But he didn't do the math to actually prove his point. He had a theory. And it was scientifically untenable for him to claim the theory was true until he did the math and proved it. And he wasn't the one that proved the heliocentric theory. It was a mathematician that came after him who learned from Galileo. So the Catholic Church's position was you are claiming something scientifically true without proof, which is absolutely accurate. He did not have the proof. Look at scientific history. He was not the one that proved the heliocentric theory to be true. And so to make a statement like this is just not true in any way. Like, so that's one of them. We can go through the rest of them and see, what comes up. But that's the challenge here. Do they mention that, oh, he was also given last rites in his deathbed, which means he was in full communion with the church? If you were convicted of heresy, you couldn't get last rites. That's a contradiction. Those two things don't happen. Did they mention that his daughter again was a nun, a Catholic nun, because they believed the faith? That he spent most of his last days in friendship with his. He knew the Pope. He knew some of the cardinals. Like those are the people he hung out with. Like this whole portrayal is not accurate. So, the rest of them we can go through at some point, and that would be fun because I've done a lot of this research. But, as you get to Einstein or Turing, like the Catholic Church had nothing to do with Turing. That was Anglican Church and so on. So you have to go and look at it. The reality is, I can show you 1,000 instances where scientists persecuted other scientists. Does that mean science is invalid? Right? Like, if that's your measure, even if that was the case, let's just say a dozen people over the last 2,000 years have been persecuted unjustifiably. And to be fair, I do think he wasn't treated well. There were people within, so there was one cardinal that offered to fund Galileo's research, and others wanted to, basically discredit him and say he was a fool. Those guys were wrong. Like, I'm not saying everybody was perfect in the situation, but if that's your measure of truth, then science itself couldn't exist because they attack each other and persecute each other and defund each other and limit each other and silence each other and all kinds of stuff at a much higher rate than any church ever has. I mean, like orders of magnitude more. So it's just a false premise to begin with. And how does AI solve that? That actually gets really interesting because we've talked about that before. AI can be impartial. If I go and look at 10 scientific studies, and I can give you an example off the top of my head, and read the abstracts of those studies, I would bet 5 of them, the abstracts aren't backed up in the data from the study. I was reading a book recently called Science Fiction that says that half of all scientific studies that are published cannot be replicated, meaning they're not scientific. If I can't replicate it, it's not science. Like that is the definition of science. And so if that's the case, the majority of the information that we have and we claim is science just isn't. I had somebody comment on my LinkedIn recently because I mentioned something, just sort of offhand remark about, kids getting sugar high or whatever. He's like, science has proven that's not right. I'm like, okay, send me the study. And he didn't send me a study, he sent me an article. An article was interpreting a study. There was no link to the study. I couldn't read the actual study. So I went and found studies on my own. And the studies basically said, yep, some say there's a connection, some say there's not. It clearly wasn't settled science, but an article on WebMD said there's no such thing as a sugar high with no linked studies or references. And so science said it doesn't exist. Well, that wasn't reality. Like if you go and look at the research, that wasn't true. So does that mean, Rob, that WebMD is persecuting scientists because they're not exposing the truth? I mean,
Depends who wrote it, right? If the Pope wrote it, then I would say yes, but probably unlikely.
Exactly. If the Pope or somebody disagreed with you, meaning if you're pro-vaccine and an anti-vaxxer wrote it, or you're anti-vaccine or pro-vaxxer, like it's now we're getting into areas that have nothing to do with what's pure science. And there probably are some weirdos out there that don't like science, but most people love science and appreciate it for what truth it can bring. The problem is when you ignore the scientific method, and half of our published research cannot be replicated, and yet people are trouting out, hey, science said this, science said that, without ever looking at it and knowing the truth. That's not what it's supposed to be. So AI can help with that because it's not going to be biased. The problem is all the tools that are currently out there, because I've done this research with the Scholar app, the Consensus app, only read the abstracts. They don't go through and do the data analysis. And I think there's a financial reason there because you got to pay for the studies to get access to them. And so I'm pretty sure that's the reason that they don't do anything besides the abstracts. The abstracts are generally free. But that being the case, that's a big problem because until we have an AI that has access to all of the published studies and can say, wait a sec, these half or these quarter aren't valid because their sample sizes were too small. Like, there we go, done. Ignore all of these, right? Or, these ones are less certain because they didn't have a double-blind control group, right, with placebo. All right, so these are less science than others. We can use AI to do all of those things and not just say, well, some paper was written, so it must be true. Because that's proven to be problematic in our current scientific literature. I don't know
Sure,
if that
Greg.
answered your question.
On multiple levels, I think it did. Yeah, I actually didn't ask anymore.
You got it, Greg.
If you got anything.
I can talk about, let's see, we're talking about free will and stuff. I think Brian said everything perfectly, man. But I'll tell you, if you want to talk about free will, I'm pretty sure we have it. I mean, there are plenty of experiments that we've done that have shown or would imply that the universe is based on choice. I mean, how else would you explain the double slit experiment? I mean, that's pretty much us seeing the universe's mechanics behind the scene. It would imply that there is some mechanism by which there is a way to make a choice to go left or to go right. Okay. Now, I can't tell you about anybody else out there. All I can tell you about is me. And from my experience in life, I would say there have definitely been times where I've been able to choose, where I've been able to go left, where I've been able to go right. You can almost feel those moments where your life changes from the decisions you've made. Now, I don't know if that happens to anybody else, but I definitely feel it in my life. So I believe I have free will. Now, let's talk about AI. Can AI have free will? No, it cannot have free will. It is a machine. It works by triggering certain sets of things, one at a time, one at a time, one at a time. There is not any place in that process, in the mechanism, where it can suddenly go, no, I don't want to do this. I want to do that. It can't. It is not physically possible. There is no mechanism that gives it the ability to think about anything. It is not thinking. It is lining up patterns to complete a pattern. That's all it's doing. It feels real. It feels like it's alive. When you talk to some of these things, especially in the last week or two, they really feel alive. They are not. Every time you type something into these machines, a whole bunch of different things happen. And those models return back a whole bunch of different responses, but it's tuning those just to give you the one that the programmers think is going to be the best. Okay. So you're not actually getting what a machine would think. You're getting the results of what a programmer decided and determined that the machine would do in response to something you did. There is no free will anywhere in any of that. There is no way that you can break that down to a point where you can say, hey, this is the spot right here where the machine is changing whatever it's doing. It doesn't exist.
Yep.
So,
I would just clarify your wording slightly. It's not explicitly programmed. It's based on the training data and the objective functions and the fine tuning. So I get your point, but if anybody's watching this that really understands the tech, they're going to take argument with programming because it's not officially how it happens, but it is the training data.
some of it is, but some of it is programming. For
Well,
example,
the fine tuning.
well, some of it's beyond fine tuning. For example, I might get a result back from the model, and then my PHP or Python code might look at the result and say, no, that doesn't quite match because it's too long of a string, or because the JSON's broken, or because it's this, or because it's that. And so then my PHP or Python app might take that and send it back to the model, or it might send it to another model and say, hey, can you fix this broken JSON so that we can then say, we're going to do that with it? That's not a conscious thing happening. That's just
Sure.
a giant Rube Goldberg machine that has phenomenally awesome results.
And I
So-
think,
so-
Chuck, you just summarized it. Greg, do you have something to add? Because I think we
Yeah.
based on what Chuck was saying.
So one thing to keep in mind, a lot of people like to equate novelty with free will and choice, right? So they say, oh, this AI did something we didn't program it to do. Okay, sort of. Just because it was able to take emojis and tell you what movie it was doesn't mean that it has a choice of free will. So being able to do something new and unique and creative, whatever you want to call it, different that wasn't specifically programmed to it, does not equate to being alive or free will. There are things that, and that's what a lot of people try to argue, like, oh, it did all this new novel things we never told it to do. It's like, okay, that doesn't actually make it real or alive. It just literally means it made some other connection, some other pathway it took to just spit something out that, that's new to us. That's, and so that's one thing to keep in mind, that people like to see it that way. And we go over in our book how that's actually not a good definition or a good thing to use to determine the autonomy, the ability of the AIs to actually think and make decisions and make their own choices and that kind of stuff.
All right, to summarize it then, 2 points there that I think Chuck brought out. So one, AI helps us prove who's right. So I said Sapolsky's argument of why free will doesn't exist is actually a perfect argument for why our classical understanding of free will is accurate. And so AI will never go outside its training data, like Chuck said, won't ever go outside its fine-tuning or programming, like Chuck was pointing out. And if that's the case, then Sapolsky's wrong, because we have a system that's purely determined. It's based on inputs and outputs, and it's going to come. No, you can't predict necessarily the output, because if you ask it the same question 3 different ways, whatever, it can vary on that. That's not the point. The point is you could, and actually we don't have the capability to do this right now, but meaning you can't look into the system and say, why did you make that decision? And if you asked it why, it's not actually going to answer why. It's just going to give you the next most likely answer that it thinks you want to hear, essentially. So that shows that there is a thing that has neural connections and all the things that our brain has, but is completely determined. And that's not what happens with humans. So I think AI helps us prove out this point. Secondly, for you to step forward and say, hey, free will doesn't exist. So like Sam Harris says this and a lot of the modern atheists, it's not because it's rational or scientific, it's because it matches their moral belief system. But to do that, you would have to then disprove the most prominent system, which we already have talked about over the last 2,000 to 4,000 years. And I think they've actually shown that it's most likely to be true. You would also then have to disprove Chuck's understanding of his experience of his personal life of free will and everyone else on the planet. Our political systems, our economic systems, our social systems, our justice systems are all based on this concept of free will. So for you to say, hey, but science says this doesn't exist, and let me ignore all of this other research that has created society for the last 4,000 years and all the ways that we've discussed, and I'm just going to assume all these immaterial things don't exist, including free will, is not the proper way to proceed. What you have to do is take the most common and popular and effective theory, which we have and we've explained today, and then show how that's wrong. And they haven't done that. They just came up with a new theory and said, well, now you have to disprove my new theory. And that's not the way that science and knowledge progresses. Because they haven't, like, why should we disprove yours when all of our research and all of our experience and thousands of years of history shows this is the most likely one, and you haven't given us any evidence that says it's not. So that is where I would summarize it, that the burden of proof is on them to disprove the society's belief systems on free will for the last millennia, not on us to accept theirs and then somehow disprove it without the core base that we already have.